Hello everyone, and yes, it is me again with another game from the FIDE Candidates Tournament 2022. It's Hikaru Nakamura with the white pieces against Teimour Rajabov. The games are incredibly wild, and you guys will enjoy this one. If you've enjoyed the previous two, you will enjoy this one as well. Players are just playing incredible chess. There are no quick draws. Everyone is here to fight, and that's really awesome. So let's dive straight into it. There is quite a lot to enjoy. Nakamura has the white pieces, and he opens with e4. We have e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, and the bishop to b5, going for the Ruy Lopez. And Rajabov, of course, goes for knight to f6, the Berlin defense, because like in Hikaru's game, whoever lost a game playing the Berlin defense. So d3, we have bishop to c5, and now Hikaru doesn't go for the standard c3 or bishop captures on c6. He goes for the incredibly rare knight b to d2. And okay, knight to d4 by Rajabov, now threatening to pick up the bishop here, but basically offering a trade of knights. Hikaru trades, we have captures, and now pawn to c3. Chases away the bishop to b6, and now pawn to d4. We have pawn to c6 now, attacking the bishop, and now moving the bishop back would allow black to immediately go for this d5 thrust, so we don't want to allow that. D captures on e5 is better, and basically it's the only move that anyone ever plays in this position. So c captures on b5, e captures on f6, and queen captures on f6, already threatening checkmate on f2. Hikaru castles, and Rajabov castles here. And now queen to h5. It's like Yanni Pomnishi is playing with the white pieces, but he might as well be, because here Hikaru is actually following the game Nepo played against Levon Aronian in 2020 that Nepo won, but also Nakamura had this position against Aronian in a classical game in Croatia in 2019 in the Grand Chester that was played in Zagreb, where knight to f3 was played by Hikaru. That game ended in a draw, but here Hikaru says, all right, Nepo knows how to play nice, barbaric chess. Let's just do what Nepo does. So Hikaru plays queen to h5, and now queen to c6. We have rook to e1. In the game Nepo versus Aronian, knight to f3 was played, but here we have rook to e1 by Hikaru. This is what he prepared, and now it is as of move 13 that we have a completely new game. So how do you tackle this? Well, there are quite a few tries here. You could play d6. You could also play f5. f5 is very interesting. If he captures, we're going to play d6. Now go after the f5 pawn, and the game continues. It's a very dynamic way to treat this position with black. But in the game, we have rook to e8 by Rajabov, and now knight to f3. We have pawn to d5, striking in the center. It also means giving up this pawn, but Rajabov wants to get some development in. So e captures on d5, rook captures on e1 with check, knight captures, and now queen to c4. We have pawn to h3, creating a little bit of breathing room for the king, and bishop to d7 now. We have queen to f3, and rook to e8, activating the rook. We have bishop to e3, offering a trade of bishops, and Rajabov trades. We have bishop captures, pawn captures, and now rook to e5. Going after the d5 pawn, and while you could just defend it with rook to d1, Hikaru plays a pawn to d6, which is basically giving up a pawn, but it also allows him to open up the position a little bit and create some chances. So queen to d5, offering a queen trade, but also just going after the d6 pawn, and now Hikaru defends it. Rook to d1, Rajabov trades here. We have queen captures, knight captures, and rook captures on e3, giving back the pawn, but keeping the passed pawn on d6. So rook to d5 by Hikaru, preparing rook to c5 to c7 to put pressure on the 7th rank, and now pawn to f6. We have rook to c5 and rook to e6 here, going after the pawn. Rook to c7, now trading the d pawn for the b pawn, and of course we have a trade. Rook captures, and pawn to a6 now. And the position is very much playable for both sides. The material is equal. It's a bishop against the knight, and Hikaru plays knight to d4. But the knight on d4 can never be challenged. There is no c pawn or e pawn to challenge the knight, and also the knight is on a dark square, so the light square bishop can't challenge it. This knight can can remain on d4 for as long as it pleases, or rather for as long as Hikaru pleases, and that is very annoying when you play against such a powerful knight. So here we have h5 by Rajabov, pawn to h4, and now g5. Trading off some material on the king side, pawn to g3, and the king to f7. We have king to f2, both players just improving the position of their kings. You have to activate them. King g6, king to e3, and now rook to d5. We have rook to a7. Hikaru goes after the pawn here. Now we have a repetition. Rook to d6 and pawn to b3. We have bishop to e6, and here rook to c7. Hikaru taking away some very, very important squares from Rajabov's pieces. And here it's not easy to find a move for Rajabov. Basically, what you want to do is just waste a move with something like bishop to d7 or bishop to g4 or bishop to h3. Not spoil your position or anything. Keep the rook on d6. But Rajabov played rook to d5, which is a bit more active square for the rook, but it allows Hikaru to infiltrate the 6th rank. He doesn't mind this, which is very, very interesting. So Hikaru goes for rook to c6. Now comes rook e5 check, king to f2, not king d3 to allow bishop to f5 check, so king back to f2, and now bishop to d7, and of course rook captures on a6. Here Hikaru grabs a pawn, g captures, and rook to e4, going after the h4 pawn. We have rook to d6 now, attacking the bishop, and bishop to c8. We have rook to d8 going after the bishop. Now bishop to g4. Rook to d5, again putting pressure on the b5 pawn, and just bishop back to c8. And it's a very, very tricky position. Can you ever capture the pawn on b5 and allow rook captures on h4? It would be dangerous. So Hikaru first waits. He plays rook to c5, again goes after the bishop. Bishop d7, rook to c7, bishop to e8, and now he plays knight to f3. He defends his h4 pawn, but now we have rook to e6, rook to a7, and now rook back to e4. We have rook to a8 going after the bishop if the rook moves, of course, and king to f7, just adding a defender to the bishop. We have rook to d8, and now rook to e7. So it seems like even though you're up a pawn, it's not very easy to make some sort of a push here. The bishop here just beautifully defends the pawn. So here rook to d2, and now rook to e4. Again, putting pressure on the pawn. If the knight ever moves, we have rook back to d5, attacking the h5 pawn, and now king g6, simply defending it. And now we have pawn to a3. Rook to c5 is also a good try for Hikaru, just preparing c4, but he wants to wait with that. He plays a3. Now he has a very, very flexible setup, so you can push c4, you can push a4, you can push b4 if needed. So rook back to e7, and now knight to d4. The knight returns to the immortal d4 square. Rook to e4, now putting pressure on the pawn, and here Hikaru goes for it. He plays knight captures on b5, and this is a beautiful position, as you could play it. You could play it incredibly well, or you could play it well. And here, I believe Rajabov played it well, not incredibly well. Here he played rook captures on h4. A much trickier move is rook to f4 check, but it's a move you don't. If you don't know it actually exists, you I guess don't see it. The point is that now, what do you play? What move do you do with the king? If king to g3, you're gonna play rook to g4 with check, and after king to h3, you're gonna play bishop c6, attack the rook and the knight. So if the rook ever moves from the 5th rank, you're gonna win the knight, and if the rook wants to stay here to defend the knight, you're gonna have to remain on the 5th rank, but you're gonna have to move away from the d file. And now bishop d7. We threaten all sorts of nasty discoveries here. Once the king moves, now we capture it with check, and after king g2, rook to g4 check ensures a perpetual for Rajabov, because you have to go back to the h file, and then we repeat checking the white king. If you move the king to f3, then the passed pawn starts marching forward, and now it's Hikaru who's in trouble. So here, rook to f4, a slight improvement to rook captures on h4 immediately, but a very important one. So rook captures on h4, and now knight to d4 by Hikaru. We have rook to h2 with check, king to g3, now rook to d2, and now Hikaru starts pushing. Pawn to c4. Rook to d3 with check, we have king to h h4, and now bishop to f7. Attacking the rook here, Hikaru moves the rook, and now rook back to d1. Hikaru continues pushing, pawn to a4, now rook to h1 with check, king g3, and h4 with check. Here, king to g2, attacks the rook, and now rook to c1. Here, the last good attempt for Rajabov would be rook to b1, but it's incredibly difficult to understand why, as Max so nicely pointed out on Twitter. Does anyone understand the Nakamura-Rajabov endgame? I really don't think so. So here we have rook to c1, and now Hikaru starts pushing. Pawn to a5. We have king to h5, now king to f2, king to g4, and now rook to f8, going after the bishop, and this is basically where the magic happens. What do you play here? If you move the bishop, let's say bishop to g6, then the problem is we can just attack the bishop. If you defend the bishop, we can push a6. If you play rook to a1, we push c5, and it doesn't matter if you capture the a6 pawn or not, but you don't have a better move. We're just going to push c6, and after rook to a7, guarding this square, now pawn to b4 again is the winning plan. Even if bishop to e4, putting some pressure on the position, just b5. And if pawn to h3, we're going to play knight to e2, threaten this check to win the bishop. If the bishop moves here, then knight to f4 check wins the bishop, so you don't have a move. If you play king h4, we just play rook to h8 check, king to g4, and now pawn to b6 again. Completely winning. Rook to a4, we're going to play c7, and next move plays pawn to c8, just win the game. You don't have any discoveries here. Sorry, not discoveries, but you don't have any moves here that actually work. If you put the rook behind the pawn, we still promote and win the rook, so everything is completely winning here for Hikaru. So bishop to g6, or moving the bishop anywhere, isn't really a good plan. So here Rajabov tried h3. He wants to sacrifice the bishop in order to play h2 and h1 queen, because the rook already covers the h1 square, and now there is only one winning move for Hikaru. So feel free to pause the video and win the game for Hikaru while I give you a couple of seconds. So for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on spotting this incredibly difficult move to find. And for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, it is rook captures on f7. Yes, it seems like that's the first thing you thought of, but then you thought, okay, it's probably not that, because why would there be a pause the video moment? But it's actually really important that you calculate all the way, as there are many tricks in the position. So here, Rajabov played pawn to h2, and also congratulations to everyone who spotted this. It was not an easy move to make. Pawn to h2, now comes rook to g7 with check, and this is the problem. If you go to h5, then we play rook to h7, and we pick up the pawn, so you don't have the passed pawn anymore. And if king to f4, that was played in the game, now comes knight to e2 with check. That's the problem. King to e5, and now of course not going after the rook, but rather knight to g3. That's the way to win this, as now you are covering the h1 square, and there is no move here for Rajabov. If you bring a queen into the game, we just capture it, knight captures, and after rook captures on h1, just a6. This is completely winning. A1, we're going to play pawn to a7, the pawn is defended, and it's 3-1, of course, completely winning for white. So after knight to g3, rook to c2 check was played by Rajabov. King to f3, now comes rook to c3 check, king to g2, and now rook captures on b3, but Hikaru's pawns are too fast to be stopped now. Pawn to a6, rook a3, pawn to a7, and now king to d4. We have knight to f5 with check, king captures on c4, and rook to b7, cutting the king off from the b file. And next we're just going to play knight to d6 or knight a7, put the knight on c8 to defend our passed pawn, then play rook b8 and promote the pawn. That's the plan. Very simple one, but an unstoppable one. So king to c5, now we play knight to e7, and it was in this position on move 75 that Teimour Radjabov resigned the game, as there is nothing more to be done here, and Hikaru bounces back in the tournament after losing the first game to Fabiano Caruana, now wins the second one against Teimour Rajabov. So really, really an incredible comeback. The problem is after you deliver one check, we're going to put the king on h1, and there is no move for black here to make. Okay, you could make a move, and you could, or it could also be a very interesting endgame. Let's say pawn to f5, knight to c8, now preparing rook to b8, and the queening of the pawn. Let's say f4, rook to b8, f3, pawn to a8, queen, now pawn to f2, hoping for queen captures on a2, but there is queen to f3, guarding the f1 square, and now rook to a1 with check. King to h2, and now f1 queen. Black also gets a queen into the game, and now of course you can't trade. If you trade, even though you're up material, you're up a full piece. This is a known draw, of course. Rook and the knight against the rook is a draw, except some very, very special positions. But here you just have a very nice forced checkmate in 7. Queen e3 check. You're gonna go king to c6, and now you just bring the king back down. Queen e6 check, king to c5, queen to d6 check, king c4. And now a very well-known checkmating pattern with the queen and the rook. Rook to b4 check, king c3, queen to d4 check, king to c2, rook to d2 check, king c1, and queen to d2 will be checkmate. So of course both Rajabov and Hikaru know this, and after knight to c7, Rajabov resigned, and a very nice victory for Hikaru, who bounces right back with the white pieces in round 2 of the FIDE Candidates Tournament 2022. Incredible turn of events. Hope you guys are enjoying it as much as I'm enjoying making these. As is just the candidates don't always have the most exciting games, but here absolutely every game is exciting in a way, and the positions are so complicated that the players just don't have enough time to work everything out that happens in the end game. So yeah, that's the game. Hope you guys enjoyed it. We already covered 3 games from round 2. We might cover the 4th one. We'll see how it goes. I would like to wish a very happy birthday to Levan, and I would like to thank Andrew Lastova, Johan, Derek King, and Aravind Kumar Vandeli for your contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing the coverage of the candidates until it finishes. So thank you all. I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day. Sorry about so many videos in one day. See you soon.